we're going to be talking about some of the collaboration that we do here at Deque between user experience and development. And Harris is going to be helping me with that immeasurably, talking about representing the development side and myself, the user experience side, and how we build accessible products. So to get started, I'll walk through a little bit of the outline of the talk. So we're going to talk a little bit about the design and development process that we use here at Deque. We're going to go into kind of a quick overview of it and focus specifically on a couple areas that will be pertinent to the talk today. Then after that, we're going to walk through an example of 3 specific touch points that we use inside of our development process, design and development process. One of which is design review, which we hold every single week. And it is a time for the greater development team to get a chance to look at the design in much more detail and ask any important questions about the design, bring up any concerns about possibly some of the feasibility or accessibility implications of the design, and overall get a chance to open the dialogue between design and development. It's not always the first time that development has seen the design, but it's a chance for the greater team to be able to talk about that. So we're gonna go through that. The next is grooming, which many other organizations that use Agile Scrum would be familiar with. And that's when we take the design itself and we break it down into tickets and fill those tickets out with all of the necessary information. And Harris is going to lead us through that, as well as the design sync, which is something that I find is slightly unique, at least since I've worked here at Deque, that we've developed. And that is our specific touch points between the lead designer for the whatever feature or product that's being worked on and whichever developer is actively working on that respective feature or product. Then we're going to wrap it up and we'll have some time for questions at the end. So to start, we're going to go over our Deque design and development process. And this process here has 2 kind of interlocking links or interlocking flows to it. We've got an image off to the side here, and it looks like there are 2 interlocking circles. In the lower left, there's the design process called discovery. It begins with research in the upper left corner, and then moving counterclockwise, we iterate on that research. Research could contain contextual inquiry or mental modeling or many other different types of research techniques. We then iterate on the artifacts that we create out of that research, typically prototypes. We validate those prototypes through forms of validation and contextual inquiry, as well as moving into testing, which as we move back up the loop, that testing is typically in the form of usability testing. And then we groom that to the backlog, and the groom is right between the 2 circles. And that's kind of the linking point between the 2. And then we go into a feedback loop as well. We get feedback from the actual deployed product, and then we go back into research. Taking that groom to backlog, we now move clockwise, sort of like a little infinity circle between those 2 circles, into the Scrum development process. We first prioritize the groomed items that that are in the backlog, and then we develop them. And that sort of piece between prioritize and develop, that's where we're going to be talking about today. After it's developed, it goes into QA and then it's deployed. And then we pick back up more items from the backlog and we continue that loop again. So feedback informs the research, and we go through a UCD process. The designs are broken down, backlog is prioritized, features are developed, tested, deployed, and feedback is gathered to kind of give a quick snapshot of what that image is. All right. So to start, we're going to start with one of our first touch points, again, focusing on that from that grooming to the development right at that point right there. There's a few different things that we do during that time that help UX and development ensure that what gets built is what is intended to be built. So the first one is design review. And what design review is it's a weekly meeting that allows design to go over any upcoming work with the greater team. And as I mentioned, it's a great time to raise any questions, any critiques, or make any accessibility or technical notes. And that's kind of what the purpose of the design review is. I mentioned also that it's not going to be the first time, many times, that development or even many of the team members have seen the design. During that discovery process that I mentioned before, development is almost always involved in that, whether they're on some of the calls with clients or that they've just seen the designs periodically throughout the iteration process. So this isn't the first time that development has seen the designs by any stretch of the imagination, but this is the first time, or this is one of the first times, that the whole team gets together to look at a finalized design. And it gives us a chance to really, really kind of get our hands into it and figure out what the best way to document it and the questions necessary. What it's not is it's not really designed by committee. Ultimately, the lead designer who's working on it makes the calls on the design. So we are very open to feedback, and we always solicit for feedback, but ultimately the lead designer makes the decision as to how that feedback should be properly aggregated and acted on. And who participates is the entire team. So to do that, from here, we're going to actually jump into a little mock design review, and we've got a real design that we used here at Deque that we actually have reviewed and is going to look maybe familiar to some people who've used AxDev tools. And we're going to take that design through those 3 touch points, first with design review, then with grooming, and then finally with the sort of live coding, live design. So with that, I'll have Harris pull up the design, and he and I will be speaking back and forth, going over the design review. So to start in the design review, typically I'll introduce what the design is. And what this design is what we're looking at now is the settings area inside of AxDev Tools. The purpose of the settings area inside of AxDev Tools is to allow the user to configure certain aspects of AxDev Tools so that it better suits their usage of it. I'm going to briefly articulate what we're looking at right now. The settings area, there's a top bar, and then after that, there is a general settings tab, which we're currently on, and an advanced settings tab. We're not going to talk about the advanced settings tab today, but we're just going to talk about the general one. There's a sort of header area that says where we're at, what view we're at, which is settings. We've got a little bit of information about the current extension and the current Axe core version. And then we've got 3 sections that are broken up. One called application settings that has the ability to select the language for the application. In this case, it's AxDev Tools. Be able to select the highlight theme. Those are 2 different select lists that are available. Then after that, we've got a rules and issues settings area. Again, we've got some select drop downs in there. One for the Axe core version, and then another one for being able to select the rule set. Finally, there's a checkbox in that same second set of settings that allows the user to enable and disable best practices. And then finally, we've got one more set here that is the AxDev Tools theme, which is a set of radio buttons that are radio controls that allows the user to either follow the browser settings, choose the dark theme or the light theme. And at the very bottom, there is a back, which would take you back to whatever previous view you were at, or save, which is currently disabled.
Cool. Well, thanks for the overview, Aaron. That's helpful. And so, yeah, I was previously, before a product owner, one of the lead front end devs. So this design review thing is something that I'm super familiar with. Aaron and I have been working together a lot, so something we're comfortable doing. And so at this point, after Aaron's given me a complete rundown of everything, and given me and the whole team, keep in mind, complete rundown of all the designs, like he said, a lot of us maybe have been familiarized with the concept, or at least the feature set. Maybe we saw it on a roadmap meeting. Maybe we saw the backlog item created by the product manager before it was groomed, obviously. But I definitely, we're at AxeCon right now, right? So we're definitely gonna be talking about accessibility a little bit. Our team actually is fortunate enough to have a lot of developers who are familiar with accessibility. Some of them are actually experts. So, I definitely want to touch on the fact that we're thinking about this from the design phase. That's that shift left that you might hear Deque say a lot. So right off the bat, and like Aaron said, this is a real design we use. So I'm guessing my memory is that of a goldfish, so I can't tell you for sure, but I'm guessing this is what I actually said when we reviewed this, which is, okay, Aaron, I'm seeing a lot of groups of form fields. So I want to make a note for the developers that we want to use a group role around each set of fields. So the thing wrapping application settings should have role group, and let's make sure that group is labeled by the given heading. So we're looking at 3 groups, right? Application settings, rules and issue settings, like Aaron said. And then finally, this Axe DevTools theme, which I want to make a note of also, that's not going to be a role group. It's going to be a role radio group, because we just have nothing but radio buttons there. So that's something I think we should either document in a ticket here, Aaron, or in the documentation field of this UX pin that we're looking at.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and put it into the I'll drop it inside the documentation field inside of here, and when we're all done, we'll get a chance to look at that.
Cool. So yeah, right now what we're kind of seeing is Aaron's going to be taking some notes. A lot of times it's not just some one-way feedback. It's the whole group conversing about the accessibility statement I just made. But moving on, so I think if we group them, that'll be great. One thing I noticed that you didn't necessarily cover, but I can probably assume what we're going to do, is this save button appears to be disabled. So if you want to walk us through maybe what interaction there is, I can make some assumptions, but I'd rather hear what you were thinking as far as when the save button is disabled, what happens if I click back after making some changes, all those kind of edge case interactions.
Sure. Yeah, great question. So the save button becomes enabled whenever you make a change anywhere on here that's different from whatever the settings were saved before. So if the settings are just like this, it's going to be disabled. So let's say I were to change the rule set to be 2.1 AAA, for example, that save button would be enabled. And if you tried to hit back without saving at that point, you would get an informational alert. So I'll make a note of that as well inside there. I'll put a note on top of the save button so that we can review that later, and we'll make sure to put that in the ticket as well.
And so maybe you just covered it, but so are we saying if I let's say make a change from file my browser settings to light theme, save will become enabled, which I get that. Right. So but if I revert that change back, does it become disabled again?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, cool. Exactly.
Okay, so I'm going to break out of Harris in the design review mode. We're just trying to give you an idea of things that we bring up in design review. If your team doesn't already do this, I think it's really helpful because it allows the designer to hear the perspective of the developers. Maybe it might be technical limitations, it might be security considerations. Hopefully, it's accessibility. You got to be talking about this now. So if you have an expert in-house, whether it's someone on your team or just in your org, pull them into these kind of sessions, because it's always beneficial to not only map out like the normal things like pixels and alignments, but accessibility and edge cases that might need to be documented in the grooming stage, which we'll get to in a little bit. And the last question, I'm going to go back into Harrison design review mode. I have one more question for Aaron, and maybe for the whole team, because it's not always the designer who has to come up with these, because words are hard. But I was wondering if we could maybe document what the tooltip text for each of these 3 question mark. And sorry, let me describe this. So beside the Axe core version, we have a little question mark icon that when hovered or focused, a tooltip is triggered, but it looks like we kind of just have some placeholder there. So we have a tooltip for Axe core, select rule set, and enable best practices. So I wonder if we as a team could decide on at least some rough wording there. And this might even be a time where we ping Ryan in marketing, who introduced us, to help us with the wording, because marketing usually has somewhat of a say there. But we won't pull them in.
Absolutely.
Let's just decide on that, you and I here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll go ahead and I'll drop it into the documentation as well. But that's a good point. Many times we will also document things like tooltips or things like informational stuff, where the designer may have some thoughts on it, but other team members may have some thoughts as well. And we can just document those on the fly. So rather than me creating a little tooltip thing and having it, show up here and filling it with a bunch of text, because we're using standard patterns inside of Cauldron, which is our accessible pattern library that we use here at Deque, we know that we're going to be using the tooltip pattern. And so we can just provide the text, and that's exactly what I've done. So if you refresh this, you should see a documentation tab show up right here. And there it is.
Beautiful.
And so I went ahead and documented a few of these different areas that we can use, and UXPin provides us the ability to be able to click or hover on some of these things and see some of the documentation that may be relevant to development, and also possibly to QA as well as they go through and test it.
Cool. And we're not like sponsored by UXPin. We happen to use it. We have Aaron puts in like beautiful annotations. Sometimes we use this documentation panel, but do whatever works for your team, right? Like if you want to, all this documentation stuff and it might actually end up being in the ticket itself too. So, you definitely don't get discouraged if whatever software the design team is using doesn't support some of this stuff, because at the end of the day, it just matters that we have this information documented somewhere. It could be in the product owner's notebook that they're handwriting that they end up converting into a ticket in the future. But just discussing the feature set at hand, the edge cases, the accessibility considerations, and documenting them somewhere to be added to a ticket in the future is what the important part is.
And you'll see that we'll have a little bit of redundancy to this documentation as well as we move over to grooming, which I think is a good transition because that's where we're going next.
Cool. And I just wanted to point out, the software we happen to use is great because the developer can pick this design up. It's an interactive prototype, and you can click on various elements to see things like the pixel spacing. So that's how our team documents pixels, colors, in some cases even components. I just selected, what I did is I selected spec mode, and now I'm kind of hovering over each element. And as I'm doing it, it's showing cool grid of measurements, like how many pixels between each thing around it. And I also just selected the back button. And one just real quick noteworthy thing is that Aaron set up his UX pin with to make it aware of what components we have in our accessible pattern library. So as soon as I selected the back button, it says you're using the secondary dark theme Cauldron button. So it's actually really useful for devs to get a reminder of what's in that Cauldron toolkit, so you don't have to rewrite, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? So with that, I'll hand it back to Aaron. We'll go back to slide land. We're going to talk about grooming. Actually, sorry, I'm handing it to myself. I'll do the grooming. I'm putting my my PM or PO hat on right now, and grooming is the next step. So we just did some design review. The team's excited about this upcoming work. I think we're ready to take the product manager's requirements and the designs that Aaron's iterated through with the whole team to create a ticket. So what is grooming? It's where the team sorts through ungroomed tickets created by the product manager and fills them up or beefs them up with some information necessary in order to implement it. So whether that's the design information, we'll probably link to the UX pin, business requirements, stuff like user stories is often relevant. As a user, I would like to be able to configure light and dark theme in a nice, easy to use settings UI, which is maybe the feature we're working on right now. And implementation details so that the developers can pick up the work easily and effectively. We want to have all those questions answered. We don't want a bunch of churn, a bunch of back and forth saying, wait, Aaron, what do we do in this edge case? We want to really sort all that out up front. Of course, we're humans, we might miss something, but that's the idea, is a groom ticket should be ready to be worked on with no questions asked. What grooming is not, though, is a time to pivot or alter designs, redefine the minimum viable product, change business requirements, scope creep yourself. It's important for our team's velocity that we don't do a bunch of that by the time we're ready to groom a ticket, because we find it super inefficient. We end up, let's say we have to make a design tweak. Of course, that might happen. Requirements change, reality changes, but we don't push that work forward just because we're already almost, through the grooming stage. We'll actually say, okay, taking these new requirements, Aaron's going to have to go back, redesign a solution, and we're actually going to go back through that diagram that Aaron was showing, that bottom left side, where we're going to do design and review with the team, and we'll eventually get back to grooming. And who participates in our grooming sessions is usually the product manager, product owner, lead dev, and lead designer. Also, in certain scenarios, maybe, our team actually works on such a wide variety of things that often beyond the core team that I just listed, a developer who is super familiar with that part of the code that maybe the feature set is related to will join in. So we're pretty informal. It's not like some gatekeeping meeting. It's more like an efficient way to make sure that we get the right information down in the ticket. So with that being said, let's do another example. And this time the example is pertaining to grooming. So we've already reviewed the designs. I didn't want to make everyone sit and watch me type. I'm slow and I have typos all over the place. So I've actually went ahead and prepared for once the ticket itself, but it's really just, it should look really familiar. So I have a title to my GitHub issue. This is the actual extension repo, by the way. Like Aaron said, you might be already familiar with this UI. And we're going to make some fixes that may or may not have actually been shipped, bugs and layout tweaks. But anyway, this groom ticket, I made a nice concise title, implement new settings page. That's kind of the voicing our team uses. Like I said, I've seen user stories work really well too. That describes, why we're implementing a feature. But I'm going to go to preview mode here in GitHub and zoom in. Sorry about that. And what we're looking at is a link to the UX pin that you all just reviewed with us, and then a heading that says requirements with a bulleted list of requirements. So all the things we went over already, the role group and the labeling for those groups, the scenarios in which the save and back buttons are disabled or will throw up an alert if you make a change and go back, and even the tooltip text. So as Aaron said a minute ago, we're a little redundant here, but we want to just show you all the different ways you can be doing this. We didn't want to make it very specific to UX pin or to our specific workflow. So here's where some redundant tooltip text is documented. And then another thing we like to do, like I said, the lead developers on the call, maybe even another developer. So it's good to take some dev notes, like things like maybe not even in our pattern library, but in the actual extension itself, we actually have a settings group component for the settings groups. So that'll make it easy for the dev to pick up and fix and make sure they implement the role grouping and ARIA labeled by mechanism that we've documented above as a requirement. And then some things that might not be as obvious, like, hey, we have this cool cauldron component for the question mark tooltip things. It's called tooltip tab stop. So go ahead and utilize that. And lastly, in a ticket, sometimes it's necessary. A lot of times between the requirements and the title of the pull request, our QA engineers will know what to do. Sometimes there's some quirks and some gotchas, if you will, that we'll document as QA notes. So in this case, this is actually fictional, but I said, be sure to monitor your network requests from the extension to verify that each action is tracked within the settings view by our analytics. So that would be like something like, Axe core version change or something, for example. So that's really what it looks like. Because we're really just solidifying this feature as we go through. So we did a design review and it's this brand new thing to us, and we're trying to think of it from every angle, and we're asking the questions as a group. And now we're actually just grooming that ticket. So all this kind of feeds into one another and makes it like a really solid process that helps us prevent missing things, not thinking things through. Because like I said, we don't want to go and have a developer pick up a ticket and go, oh, Aaron, what about this? What about that? It's just not efficient. So we want to make sure we're really, really trying hard to think about accessibility and all the edge cases from the start. That's good. So next up, weekly syncs, live design and coding. So this is where the designers and developer who is implementing said feature will get together via screen share. We used to have an in-person office in the before time where Aaron and I he could look over my shoulder at my desk, but now we're across the country from each other. So we do Zooms where I screen share if I'm the one implementing the feature. And we go over a pre-production server, usually a local build, especially in the case of the extension. There's not really some URL that Aaron could go to check out himself. I could send him a zip file or something, but it's more efficient for me as the owner of the implementation to share my screen and just go over the ins and outs with the designer. We'll compare them to the prototype often. And that's where the dev can make, little CSS tweaks, making sure everything's pixel perfect or close enough. And so it's a really beneficial thing to do that you probably want to pull the developer in once there's something good to show. So if a feature is broken down into several different commits and pull requests, I'm not going to bother Aaron every step of the way. But once I have something that says, yeah, this feature is basically done, I've met my definition of done, it looks like it's the MVP, let's go over it with Aaron now, or with whoever the designer was who was working on the project. But what these live design sync ups are not are a chance to make design changes. So we're really not going to be making changes to the UX pin during this. We're going to be making changes to the implementation. Hopefully very few or none, but who knows? Sometimes the developer will miss a ton that the designer has a great eye for. And again, we're not going to be increasing the scope of the work. That's not the time for this. If we didn't catch it in design review and in grooming, you're definitely not going to add scope to the work in this sync up. And like I said already, it's the lead designer and whichever developer is actively implementing the design. So with that, again, we'll have time for questions at the end. We're going to do another example. And this example will be a collaboration between Aaron and I. Aaron's going to be the UX representation. I'll be the developer representation. So I'm no longer the product owner. So Aaron, I've gone to this mom and pop startup site called Google, just to have, because we're working in an extension. So I have Google open in my browser, and beside that is the DevTools extension. And just so you can see how everything works, is I'm on the splash screen of the start screen. I go to this little kebab menu in the top right corner and click on settings. And here I am at a version of so this should look familiar because this is my best attempt to match the designs that Aaron and I have gone over already with you. So Aaron, what do you think of our work so far?
So there's a few things that we'll probably need to take a look at. The first of which is that it looks like there's some missing margin between the some of the select lists inside of there, and there's a misalignment of the informational tooltips there. Though it looks like we got the right text in them. So let's pop back into the design and take a peek and see what's going on.
I see what you're saying now. Looks like we got what, 24 pixels?
Yep.
Okay. How did I miss that? Silly me. But you know what? 24 pixels rings a bell for me, Aaron. 24 pixels happens to be our cauldron variable space large. So I think this should be easy for me to implement. So let me actually, real quick, before you give me more critiques, I'm going to go ahead and fix that so we can make sure it should just be one line of CSS. So bear with me. Now keep in mind, everyone, if it's some huge change that's not practical to make live on the scene, move on and maybe have a quick sync up later, or send a screenshot later, or have the designer review the pull request. But for now, like most of the time, it's really just little tweak margins like this. So I'll be able to quickly make the code change. So I'm actually in the real source code for the Axe extension. This isn't some fake project. And I to not make you watch me type weird selectors, I had it pre-filled in. But what I'm going to do, like I said, is actually write some new CSS. Wow, margin bottom of for these groups and these fields. I'm going to set the margin bottom to be our space large variable. So I'm going to hit save, and I'm going to do a little cool trick called reload frame. So I'm back in my browser. I got the DevTools panel open. I'm going to reload frame. That will actually have my changes propagated because I have a development server running that just rebuilt the extension as I made the code change. So voila. What do you think, Aaron? Does it look right now?
Looks much better. And maybe we can just inspect it real quick to make sure that those changes went through properly.
Yes, and another reason I want to inspect it to make sure we did the other thing we've talked about a lot, which is the grouping mechanism. So let's go to the box model. Yes. It looks like we're good here. Yep. And that margin is 24. Beautiful.
Great.
Okay, so let's look at this group. Here's the group. Here's the heading. Tisk tisk, Harris, you missed your own feedback, believe it or not, to add the role group and the labeling mechanism. So before we continue, Aaron, I want to, and actually, hey, before I do that, do the alignment of the tooltips look right to you? Looks about right.
Yeah, it looks like it fixed those as well, which is great.
Wow, one line of CSS to fix two issues. Beautiful. What I'm going to do now is What I'm doing now is add that grouping mechanism. And so this is a React app. As I said in the Groom ticket, if you remember, I said, hey, utilize the settings group. So I'm going to go, I don't really know what's going on. I don't know what I just did wrong. I'm going to go back to that component and see what's going on. So here on the left-hand side of my code editor, I'm actually going to just get rid of the CSS file that I had open. We have settings group. And the reason this is so important is that I'm going to be able to fix this issue in this one component, and it will apply to the application settings, rule settings, and Axe DevTools theme. So I already have an ID on, on the heading. I just forgot to add role equals group to the div. And children here in this context, it's a React prop, but basically it will represent all the fields in the group, not the heading, but the fields themselves. And any other kind of UI like the help text. So I've added role group, oops, and I'm going to add aria labeled by, as the ticket says, pointed to the ID of the heading. So group heading ID, and I'm going to hit save. My dev server just did the buildy build stuff, and let's check it one more time, see if we're good. Reload frame, go back to settings. And one thing I did gloss over is, yes, we are inspecting the inspector. It's pretty meta, it's pretty awesome. So I'm actually looking at a DevTools inspector of our DevTools, which is kind of funny. Might be a new concept for some of you. So I'm going to go ahead and inspect the group and see if I did stuff right for once. Let's see. I'm going to go into my group. Oh, beautiful. I have H3 ID group heading 1, application settings is the text there, and then followed by the group, div role group, already labeled by group heading 1. Imagine that. So unless you see anything else, Aaron, I think I'm ready to push some code, have the team review the code changes themselves.
Yeah, very good. Final thoughts on this is one of the real advantages of this is that it allows the designer and the developer to be looking at the code base at the same time and make adjustments on the fly. This isn't a place where they're going to do massive development, but a place where they can do really important tweaks. As Harris mentioned, the vast majority of the stuff that we do are just like layout issues, small little things here and there, and making sure that that everything's cleaned up the way that it's supposed to be. And the designer can get an opportunity at the same time to be able to sign off on something right then and there, that it looks good and that everything matches the intent of the design.
And to kind of tie this in with the title, you know, we're talking about just collaboration every step of the way. I definitely want to mention that, you know, it's not just these 3 things. These are 3 kind of pillars of the collaboration between the designers and devs at Deque. But, you know, we have open communication channels. So if Aaron's not in the meeting and I need some help or some clarification, I can Slack him. We can hop on ad hoc Zooms. But the important part is that, you know, there's some ownership of the implementation as me as the developer, and actually a little bit of a keeping an eye on the implementation from the designer side, which we have found is super rare. Like a lot of the customers I've talked to, it's like, we're like, so how do the designers and developers collaborate at your organization? They're like, what? I mean, we give them the designs. What else do you want? So it's kind of the whole design, throw it over a fence, plug your ears, la, la, la. I hope everything goes well. And then, you know, they wonder why the application's in this weird, buggy, you know, layout defect riddled state. So, you know, we really just wanted to create a presentation just showing how we happen to do collaboration between these 2 types of dev team members. But do whatever fits best in your existing workflows. But the important part is get that collaboration to happen. Don't just toss designs over a fence and run away.
So I think to move on from here, we just have a little bit of a wrap up, and then we'll open it up to questions. And as Harris mentioned, the important thing to remember is to find points during your development process where it makes the most sense for design and development to work together. Sometimes QA as well. Maybe you want to be involved in that. I've worked in other places where during the design review, QA would come in and write their test cases at the same time, because they would want to look and see what the hero flow is, and they would want to see what the intent of the design is, and what the primary pathing is through the prototype and respectively for the user. And so they would write a lot of their test cases at the same time. And sometimes even the development and design would get a chance to chat with them afterward and go over those test cases and make sure that they really map together with what the intent is for the overall flow. Again, I mentioned this, any of these three pillars are really important when we started to get to the point where we're ready to actually implement the design. But it's not the first time that many of the developers have seen the designs before. It's important during the discovery process to involve development, even QA, even the entire team, depending on the comfort level and size of your team, to in that process of research and iteration and ideation. That's kind of pretty much the big takeaways from it. We find these to be really effective. The third one, some of them may be very familiar to you. The third one, where we have these live syncs and we actually do live coding on the fly. This is the first place that I've done that, and I find it to be one of the most important gatekeeping points, because it allows me to see the actual build before it gets pushed and before it goes through review, and can sign off on it. And I think that our development team really enjoys it as well, so they can feel confident that the designer really did sign off on the work and that it represents what we intend to build.
And you know who else enjoys it is the whole team, but the business side of things, right? Because if we find, and actually not doing this, sometimes skipping on it has come up in our team's retrospective, years ago. We're actually pretty good about it now. We try to be, but what ends up happening if we don't do this is we build such dynamic, complex applications that it's so easy for a developer to miss stuff. It's so easy for all of us to miss stuff in all those stages, like design, review, and grooming. We're only humans, so we're going to miss out on things. So having all these different stages before I even push code is crucial, and it ends up saving the company time and money, because otherwise QA has to find it. They have to spend time looking at pixel perfection implementation details. They can spend more time hammering on it from performance perspective or whatever else it might be. But this ends up saving us so much time, having to reiterate on implementation and defects as a result of that. This actually has saved us tons of time. So highly recommend it. As Aaron said, the devs and the designers love it, but I think the business loves it too.
Yeah, the only other thing I'll say is you'll notice that when we talk about defects, whether they're aesthetic, behavioral, or accessibility defects, we kind of roll them all together in each of these three parts. And that may be something that's slightly more unique to organizations or other organizations, that accessibility is more ingrained into the sort of the fabric of development. Some organizations may be a little bit earlier on, and accessibility may be a distinct part of it, a distinct part of design or a distinct part of development. And so when we talk about it, we kind of talk about them all together, because we prioritize accessibility defects, whether in the design or in development, the same we would do security ones. They're really, really high defects, and so we take care of them almost immediately. So just, don't think that because we're doing all of these things all at the same time, because it happens to work for us, that you have to do it for you as well. Do what works for you. Try to integrate those things as best you can into the different stages, and maybe just try a couple of those things, or maybe focus on a few different accessibility defects that maybe come up. Maybe color contrast comes up a lot, or certain alt text comes up a lot, and you want to make sure that you consider those things when you're going through this stuff. And maybe as time goes on, you can begin to roll more of those things in.
Cool. So with that, oh yeah. Let's take it back to give it back to Ryan, and we'll do some questions. Thanks to Thomas for helping everything go smoothly behind the scenes, and Amelia and Jessica for the beautiful interpretations.
Sorry about that. Technical difficulties on my end. Can y'all hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. All right, I'll get into some questions here. There's already a ton lined up. The most popular question, and just a reminder for participants, if you want to go in and upvote the questions that you want to make sure that get addressed, now's the time to do that. Okay, how do you cultivate a psychologically safe environment during design review so everyone feels comfortable sharing and accepting feedback?
Yeah, I'll take that one. It's a great question because it dips into the philosophy behind how UX is adopted at your organization. I'm getting a little bit of feedback, just whoever's mic isn't muted. And so one thing that's really important to foster a place where feedback can be given openly and critique can be given in a way that is productive is to ensure that critique is actually productive. It's something that our team fortunately has worked on, and I think we've gotten pretty good at it. But first and foremost, everyone has to feel an ownness for the design. So in previous places that I've been at certain life cycles, the designer kind of owned the design, quote unquote, and developers there'd be friction between the designer and the design. Designers like trying to get these things done as if it's like my will trying to be imposed onto other people and force them to do work. One philosophical shift is that everybody owns the design. And this is one of the real important reasons why early on in that discovery process, that UCD process, that development is brought in early on, not only to see the designs, but to build empathy with what's going on. Not to say that your developers don't have empathy, but just as a team to build empathy for the users and what their experience are, so that as the designs begin to iterate and they begin to reflect the goals of your users, development can begin to do things like assessing whether or not this is going to be feasible to build, or whether there's going to be accessibility concerns as well. So by the time it gets to design, the design critique, at the very least, the lead developer will be well acquainted with what the intent of the design was, because they were there throughout the entire process, seeing how the design had developed. And so they become a champion for the design and feel a sense of ownership for the design. So the critique is less towards an individual and more towards the common goal of trying to get this artifact, which is the design, to be in the best state it can so that it can reflect what we need to build in order for it to build a product. Ultimately, my prototypes are not something that I hold on high, and they're like great trophies for me. Their purpose is just to get the software built properly, to get the application built properly and accessibly. And so that's ultimately what their goal is, and that we're all in this together to try and do that. Other common things, be respectful with your critiques, make sure that your critiques are, they're meaningful, they're on task. But I think it really comes down to, if I can pick one thing, it would be early on making sure that development and your greater team has a good understanding as to why you're trying to solve the problems that you're trying to solve and the goals of your users.
Thanks, Aaron. I don't know, Harris, if you want to chime in, or should I move on to the next one?
I'll do a quick little blurb. I think it's something company wide. It's part of our culture. I mean, we have what we call our core values, and one of them is open, direct, and respectful communication. So I think everybody holds everybody accountable to that. There's no silly questions. I am comfortable. Even when I was brought in fresh out of college to Deque as a junior developer, I felt empowered and comfortable disagreeing with the CEO, honestly, and that's happened. And no one's going to pull some seniority card on you. No one's going to say, why would you ask that silly question? The whole team is committed to being open, direct, but respectful. So if we ever see anything that kind of collides with that core value, we'll call it out and make sure that everyone's on the same page there, and that everyone feels comfortable bringing up whatever feedback they have.
Thanks, Harris. I think this next question flows along the same line of reasoning. How do you entice developers to want to work closely with UX folks? Oftentimes there's resistance to the partnership due to bandwidth and getting it done.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'd like to say that there's like a grassroots way of doing it, and maybe there is, and you can find a way to do it. I found it's best when the senior leadership and management team make sure that One, it is, I'm going to put in the words, required might be a very strong word. And so I don't want to call it required, but it is really, really important that the development core is involved with the UX core when it comes to the solving of the problems. We say it's the discovery process is third of the design process. It's a little bit of a misnomer. It's the process where design does the majority of their kind of day-to-day tactical and strategic work, but development is heavily involved into it, which also means in turn that development's time, if you think about that resource and allocated, they are given specific time to be able to do that. I don't think it is very rare that if I have a lead developer and I say that they need to, it's important that they come to some of the contextual inquiry calls, that they would just not come to any or refuse to come to any. That would probably, like Harris said, collide with some of our other values as well. It's just, I'm trying to be respectful of their time, but I'm also trying to get them to understand what's going on with regard to our users. And ultimately, I think that almost all developers that I've ever worked with want to do the right thing. They want to build things that are great for their users and that ultimately help solve those goals. And the being a part and participating in some of those early on steps and stages create, I think, enough of a groundswell so that when they actually get to the development side of it, which is heavily more, that other circle I mentioned, that is the development agile scrum process, design is still involved at that point, but for very specific and targeted ways. It is a bit of a culture. It is a bit of something that has to be ingrained into your culture. And it's pretty important that your management is not only signed off on it, but is advocating for it and evangelizes it in many ways. I've been to companies where we made a big shift to do exactly that. And some people didn't care for it as much and it didn't, work out, that wasn't the career path for them at that point. I'm not saying it needs to be as harsh as that, but I am saying that there has to be a commitment up and down the board in order for something like that to work. Maybe you can find it can work between a few people, but to really make it as part of the lifeblood of your development organization, everybody's got to be on board with it.
Sarah, okay. I think we can fit one short question in here before we have to wrap up. Okay, is the user, this is referring, I think, to earlier in the presentation when you were talking about process. Is the user-centered design process being done in parallel to the development, i.e. designers working on gathering backlog for sprint 2 while devs work on sprint 1?
Yes. So those are, if you think they're interlocking, they're also stacked on top of each other and they're sort of oddly going at the same time. So while I may be working on something that's going on in the future, the development will be working on something that I had just designed in the past. My top priorities and what I have to on day-to-day and sprint to sprint, if they need help on what's being built, I will always make time for that because that's actively what's going on in the sprint. But I'm also looking ahead at where we're moving in the business forward with, and where we're trying to ultimately get the product. And I may be following features through to their logical conclusion with continual sort of UCD.
Awesome. Thanks, Aaron, Harris, the ASL team. Fantastic presentation, everyone in chat, and your fantastic questions. There are so many we couldn't get to. Thanks for your excellent engagement. Really appreciate everybody's time.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you all.
Happy AxeCon.